In this film, we're going to look at some of the basic concepts in reflective practice. As social workers, really, we're on a journey, starting with reflection, moving towards critical reflection, and on to reflexivity. So for students, the journey from reflection to reflexivity is particularly important. Understanding each step of the journey is vitally important. But really for all of us, we could all do with a quick revisit and a quick refresh of what's reflection, what's critical reflection, and what is reflexivity. So we're going to look at that journey and how we map and create that journey for ourselves as practitioners. If you want to take a moment to pause the video, now would be a good time for you to think about what your thoughts are around the difference between these three concepts, and then you can revisit it later. So starting with reflection, I think most of us can make a bit of a stab at what we think reflection is. Most of us have got a clear idea about reflection, although many of us think about reflection as simply about looking back at something that's happened. But actually, reflection is something that's going on all of the time. I'm reflecting now as I'm thinking through this video and thinking, what's coming next? What have I just done? What's working now? What isn't working at the moment? That's reflecting in the moment. We're going to look at that reflection in action, on action, and for action in a separate video. But reflection isn't just about looking back, it's about thinking all of the time. It's about thinking in the moment, it's about thinking ahead. It's about exploring our feelings. How do we feel about that? What feelings does that invoke in us? It's about connecting things with our emotions. It's about understanding our values and the implications that our values have for our practice as social workers. It's about developing our understanding more clearly about what's going on here, what's actually happening, analysing things, which again we'll do separately, looking at the detail and depth of analysis. But really, analysis is about breaking down information and looking at what does that information actually mean here. And it's really, in many ways, reflection is simply about exploring things as the journey goes on. It is, though, something that we can do about anything. I don't know if you do this at home, but as a family, we sometimes sit around watching the television together and we'll pause it and go, oh, I think he did it, I think she did it, I think this is going to happen. That's being reflective. We're thinking about it. We're thinking about what we think might happen next. But it's not being critical and it's not being reflexive. It's not something that we're doing, it's something that we're simply watching. Social workers are really good at this, aren't we? We can just sit in a cafe and watch somebody walk in and we've already developed a backstory about what we think is going on for them. So being reflective is just that constant thinking, really. It may be about something that we're doing, but it may be about something that we're simply seeing. So that's reflection as a starting point. Now, in terms of critical reflection, for a long time, I've said there's one thing that makes reflection become critical. But at the end of 2018, then we had some new standards here in England for adult social work supervision from the Department of Health and Social Care, the post-qualifying standards for adult social work supervision. And in there, there's a really good glossary that explains the difference between reflection and critical reflection and on into reflexivity. And I think that's probably the best explanation that I've ever seen, really, about the difference between reflection and critical reflection. And so that's what I'm going to share with you now. As we journey from being reflective, from thinking, from analysing, from thinking about feelings and emotions and values and what's working and what's not working, then the next stage on, critical reflection becomes critical when it involves two aspects. When it's fundamental enough, so it goes into enough depth to effect transformative change. This isn't just about changing your own practice. It's not just about what will I do differently next time. It's about how can we change things on the bigger scale. How can we change things for people? How can we change people's experiences? And it's also about an analysis of power. So that glossary says that reflection becomes critical when it's based on an analysis of power dynamics, and when it strives to equalize power imbalances and maximize democratic relations. Essentially, this is all about power and the movement of power and the sharing of power and the dimensions of power. It's about really understanding power. In many ways, critical reflection is the bringing together of critical theory and reflection, and critical theory is all about power dynamics. Sometimes I think students and practitioners sometimes misunderstand critical reflection and think that maybe critical reflection is about being self-critical, is about looking at what didn't go so well. And it is always difficult to be positive when we think about that word critical, because outside of social work, the word critical might mean that being self-critical. But actually, the key thing to keep hold of in terms of reflection becoming critical is about when we go into the power dynamics. And that's clear to see from this definition taken from those standards. So we start off with reflection. We then add into it as we journey through our social work career and we develop our reflective practice skills more. We add into that reflection an understanding of power dynamics, and we go into more depth to create change. But then we need to really strive towards reflexivity or reflexive practice. So we're going to try and look at what that means in terms of the journey as social workers. So I'm going to ask you just to take a look at that word that's up there on the screen now. Take a good look at it. What do you see in that word? Let's try and break it down. Let's try and look at the different aspects or components of reflexivity, and then we can add those together to have a more in-depth understanding of what reflexivity means. So if we start with it, if we look at just the very beginning of the word, that re means keep on doing it, doesn't it? Do it again. Think about if you put re in front of any word, when we say reuse something, recycle something, revisit something, review something. In social work, we do lots of reviews, and review simply means review, look again. So re means do it over and over again, keep it constant, keep it going. But re can also mean, in a different context, if you were to be writing a court report or writing a formal letter, you might put at the top re and then what it regards. In respect of what? So whilst reflexivity needs to be something that's done over and over and constantly, it also needs to be kept focused. What are we being reflexive about? Keep it focused. So simply from the first two letters of the word, we can start to build an idea of what this means. The next thing that I see in that word is reflex. Now, a reflex is about your automatic response, isn't it? If you go to the doctor taps your knee, your leg goes up in the air. Whether you want it to or not, it does. It's your reflex. It's your automated response. So in some ways, reflexivity is about understanding where does that automatic response come from? Why did you respond like that in that situation? It's really about, I suppose, exploring cause and effect. What caused that? What effect did it have? The next thing that I see in the word is flex. Now, to me, the word flex is all about power. I'm old enough to remember when we used to have a flex that we plugged into the kettle. We tend to call things cables nowadays, but a flex is actually something which carries power from one place to another. You can probably tell looking at me, I don't go to the gym very often. But if you do go to the gym, you'll be familiar with that phrase, people flexing their muscles. It's about showing the power that you've got. So having flex sitting centrally in the word there demonstrates to us that this is all about our understanding of power and how power moves and how power is fluid within social work situations. So can you see how we're building together what it's about? Reflex, flex. The next thing you can see in the word, flexi. Really, flexi is all about being flexible, isn't it? Being open to change, being able to create change, being flexible in the moment, being able to change your own practice in the moment as things are happening. So we've got all of these things that we're building together, and at the very end of the word, so the suffix of the word is ivity. Ivity basically means doing, doesn't it? Think about it. When we put ivity on the end of a word, creativity, activity, productivity, ivity means doing. So to be reflexive or to use reflexivity in practice means it's not enough to understand, but what are you going to do about that understanding? How are you going to use that understanding in your practice? So reflexivity is about all of those things. It's about how we connect all of those things together. But I've just asked you, what do you see in the word? Now I'm going to ask you to think about, if you thought about outside of social work, is there a word you've heard that's similar to that word, reflexivity? Because that might help us to really go deeper into exploring exactly what reflexivity is in practice. When I ask social workers that question, is there a word you've seen or heard that's similar to the word reflexivity? Then they often say, well, what about reflexology? Now, I'm no expert in reflexology by a long way. I don't like people touching my feet at all. But this is my understanding of reflexology. If I went to a reflexologist and I said, oh, I've got a really bad headache, they'd say, I'll fiddle with your big toe or something. If I said I've got a painful stomach, they'd touch a different part of my feet. So reflexology is about how your feet and lower limbs connect to the rest of your body. Now, in some ways, that can really help us to think about what reflexivity is in social work. I can't sit at home and think, oh, I've got a really bad headache, I'll just fiddle with my own big toe. It takes a professional to see those interconnections. And that's what social work is all about. Social workers see the interconnectivity in people's lives. Social workers are not experts on that person. The person is the expert on themselves. We have an expertise in connectivity. We have an expertise in understanding the connections. So do you know, in many ways, reflexivity is actually a systemic way of reflecting. It's systems theory and reflection connected together. It's understanding the systems and the connections in people's lives. Now I'm going to go back to the journey that I talked about. If you were to look at reflexology on the internet, then this is the kind of thing that comes up. Reflexologists talk about mapping your feet. Now for a journey, you need a map, don't you? So I'm going to get us to think about the map for our journey, but I'm going to get us to look for the treasure in that map. And I'm going to start off going back to the word that we're exploring together now, reflexivity. We could think about reflexive practice or the need for reflexive supervision. Sometimes you might see that word written. If I'm honest, I don't even know how to pronounce it because I've never heard it. I've just seen it written down. But reflexion, it's maybe a different type of reflection. It's taking it that little bit further. The other word I'm going to add in here now is complexity, because everything in social work is complex and becoming more and more complex as time goes on. There's something that all of those words have in common. And we can draw out of that the map for moving towards reflexivity. On a treasure map, X marks where the treasure lies. So I'm going to ask you to look at those words again, and I'm going to ask you to focus in on the X, because the X is where the treasure of social work sits. Just look at the X there. What can you see on that screen with the X? If you take a look, each word is connected around the X, and the connection is the E and the I. Every one of those words has an E before the X and an I after the X. And that's the treasure. EI is all about emotional intelligence. So in many ways, reflexivity is about connecting emotional intelligence and reflection together. It's about looking at something and thinking about the emotions that you had, the emotions that the other person had, and how those emotions are used to create connections and relationships. So connect emotional intelligence and reflection together and it begins to create reflexivity. But if you think about it, the I is all about the individual and the E is all about the environment. So in many ways, what this is how do we connect the individual with their environment? How do we look at the internal factors and the external factors? The connection of the I and the E is where the treasure lies in social work. So the treasure of social work lies around how we see the person in the context of their environment, how we help that person look at where are you now, where do you want to be, how can we work together to help you to get to that point. That's reflexivity in action. It's the real treasure of social work practice. So whilst we begin our journey as social workers with reflective abilities, we really need to strive towards having reflexive abilities. So in summary, moving from reflection through critical reflection and on into reflexivity is summarised on the screen here. Reflection is about thinking actively and persistently. It's about learning. It's about how we learn. It's about how we develop our practice. We explore our thoughts, we explore our insights and our feelings. It's not just looking back with hindsight, it's constant. Critical reflection adds in issues of power and the socio-political context and goes into enough depth to create meaningful change. And reflexivity, well, it's about all of those things, but it adds in aspects of the use of self. The key difference in many ways between reflection and reflexivity is we can be reflective about something we weren't involved in, but we can only be reflexive about something that's central to ourselves. What impact did I have on that situation? And what impact did that situation have on me? That's the circularity of self-awareness that's needed in reflexivity. It originates from research, and in many ways that's what we're doing as social workers, aren't we? We're researching what's going on for an individual. We need to do that in a reflexive way. We need to look at the individual in their environment, factors that are internal and external to the situation, and keep ourself central. In other films, we'll be exploring different tools and techniques you can use to develop reflexive practice in social work. Thanks for listening.